your guy for most underrated offensive tackle in the league, or just the guy that you wanted to talk about in this light. Zach Tom, the right tackle for the Green Bay Packers. Zach Tom's been grading very well for us this season. He's played over 800 snaps at the right tackle spot, 86.4 overall grade. That's best on the Packers. 87.3 run blocking grade, and then an 82.3 pass blocking grade. So he's been very solid in both situations. He's only given up 17 pressures and 2 sacks all season long. Talk about Zach Tom, a guy who you think is the most underrated offensive tackle in the NFL right now.
Yeah, and I should just say with these up front before people get upset, I had a long list. Like when Trevor mentioned me about this, I had a long list of like 120 players. Like there are so many players I could get into. I
appreciate you narrowing it down a little bit from 120, or we'd be here a while.
I knew that Trevor would not put up with me doing 9-hour monologues on every player in the league.
That's a you and John for the podcast, and it's like 16 hours long. It's like, all right, this is part 16 of the most underrated players in the NFL.
The thing I love about Tom, honestly, is just how disciplined he is with everything he does. It is pure technique stuff. And he actually only really gets in trouble when he plays the real best of the best. And the real best ones, Danielle Hunter, Myles Garrett, Max Crosby, these guys bring unusual and unorthodox things because they're so special and gifted. And they can fit 2 or 3 moves in where no one else can. Or you're so scared of just natural pass rush moves, right, that they can start doing unusual things to get you. And that's the only really time he loses, is when particularly Danielle Hunter got him a couple of times when they played, obviously hitting him with classic Danielle Hunter, who knows what he's thinking, what he's doing type situations. But he's just so steady and solid in everything he does. Such a slick mover, stable base, fluid, switched on to picking up anything, edge pressure, any kind of blitz, simulated look. He just picks everything up. I just think he's so in tune with the group as a whole. And Jordan Love raves constantly about, like, I just feel like I have a solid right side of my line where I can step up and climb through, and it just puts him in a solid mental space, either get rid of the ball quickly or go and create. You mentioned some of the run game stuff. He is probably right now, to me, with Trent Williams having some injury issues, not quite as dominant this season, the best pure wide zone lead guy we have in the league, and then is excellent as a cut-off guy on the backside too. So he's kind of the foundational focal point of their kick-and-go run game. And then this is a straight pass pro guy. He can get beat. He's not perfect, but he's one of those guys where he will lose 2-3 reps a game against the true tier 1 guys, and who doesn't, right? That's why the tier 1 guys, that's why they got to get paid $30-40 million if they're Micah Parsons. But he just stonewalls and shuts down the tier 2-3 rushers, unless his technique gets away from him ever so slightly. But for the most part, he's just as solid as they come, which for a 4th round pick center kicked out to right tackle, can play anywhere across your line. I just think it's one of the most impressive developmental stories in recent history.
Yeah, he's an interesting type of player because I feel as though the Packers, when they draft, they're one of those teams that have thresholds, right? They're a big threshold type of a team when it comes to, arm length and just like how guys are built when it comes to their defensive linemen and offensive linemen specifically. I think corners as well. They've had in the past, thresholds where they don't really like to go below a certain size when it comes to corners when it's drafting. You look at Zach Tom, and you mentioned just a versatile offensive lineman. If you match up his measurables, against some other offensive tackles, I mean, it's 14th percentile in height, 17th percentile in weight, 21st percentile in wingspan. But then you get to the athletic stuff, the 40-yard dash, the vertical, the 10-yard split, the broad, the 3-cone, the 20-yard shuttle, all of that above the 90th percentile. So just an athlete that they do gravitate towards. So maybe not a measurable threshold, but an athletic threshold that they like to go after with Zach Tom. And I think you bring up a really good point. Myself, I'm kind of talking to myself a little bit here. When we do scouting, sometimes we get a little too caught up in, okay, well, let me draft the guy that could block the very best of the best, that has the potential, whether it's the length or the athleticism or whatever, to draft the very best, to go up against the very best of the best. And the fact of the matter is that if you find a player who brings you all of that stuff, length, size, athleticism, IQ, experience, all of that, Ollie, they're getting drafted in the top 5. So if you don't have a top 5 pick, you're not going to get that football player. So then when we evaluate these offensive tackles that get picked a little bit outside of the top 5, and we talk about, well, he could be the type that could maybe block the very best of the best or whatever it is, sometimes you lose those guys who are just like, yeah, all right, he might struggle against the very best that there is in the NFL, but against anyone, tier 2 and below, he's going to handle pretty well. And I think that player can often get underrated in a draft class because we're chasing those guys that can defend the tier 1 and everything like that. And sometimes you got to get those guys that really just week in and week out are so damn good for you. And I think that is what Zach Tom has been over the last 2 years specifically. Last year, his first year as a full-time starter, he ended the season with an 80.3 overall pass blocking grade. This year, he's got that 87.3. So he's increasing that floor and that ceiling, I think in his second year as the right tackle there for the Green Bay Packers. So maybe not the type that they typically go towards when it comes to athletic measurables, but somebody that has been fantastic for them, and I think is a pretty good scouting lesson of you don't have to always shoot for the stars when it comes to the offensive linemen. Sometimes you got to get the guys where you go, yeah, I got faith in him. I want to put him on the right side, and we're not going to worry about him too much. But that's also not to insult how good he has gotten and how much he has gotten out of his talent as well.
Yeah, and the way he wins with IQ and understanding what his physical limitations are versus what his physical pros are, right? You mentioned he played inside. He has unbelievable grip strength. And something he does a really good job of is just contorting edge rushers once he's engaged to get them slightly off balance, to buy him the time and beats needed to properly plant his feet and then get to his anchor. His straightaway anchor, someone running through his chest, is not as solid as having a mammoth 6'7" tackle out there, right? Sometimes he just gets rocked back and dropped onto Jordan Love. But because he's got such solid grip strength, that if he can engage early and kind of get that person shuffled off their base where they have to get some kind of second surge move or try and get a dip around, his feet are so slick, so good, and his hands are so good that he can just move them and kind of get them into this kind of off-balance fight. Let's see who's got the quickest, slickest feet shuffling backwards, and no one can keep up with him because he's so good in a tight space. So he's really found ways to kind of take what his skills are and make sure even in situations where it can be difficult, right? A really wide rusher with a giant headway to run at him, finding ways to make sure they can play on his terms. That's a lot of what line players, right? Don't let guys get after you. Go and dictate the terms on your own. It's easier to do when you play inside. He's been able to take that and move it to the outside. And as you mentioned, in terms of just kind of development and scouting plays, it's a good example of in the offseason, go and take your center if he's big enough and passes just the minimum threshold, and go and see if he can play in a more valuable spot if it's considered more valuable to you, right? Why not take guys in the offseason, cross-train them, and figure out if they can play out there? There are different ways to win on the edge than just being the long guard guy who keeps people off their pads. Though I will say with Tom, what is funny is, one, he loses the same way every time when he loses. He bites on an inside step, someone goes around him, can't establish his base properly, gets his feet tied up. But he likes to play in the hand fight with long arms for a guy who does not have long arms. And sometimes, particularly against the best guys, like, hey, Zach, like, you got to realize your own physical limitation in this stuff. I get these guys are really difficult, really, really tough to block. That's just not going to be your game. And you seem to get through it against everybody else. And then when it comes to the best of the best, and maybe your best stuff doesn't always work because they're so special, he then starts getting into these panicky reps, right, where he's chasing himself. And you see it specifically against Hunter. He's played a bunch of top edge rushers this year. The Hunter one is really instructive of how he can get himself into binds. But just to have that level of elite to very good to elite production as a run blocker, specifically in one mode of run blocking. This isn't a guy who's going to maul people off the ball from the right side necessarily. He is more of a technique, finesse, wide zone type player. But to get that, plus the really stonewally pass protection for a guy who's costing you $1 million a year until they got to figure out a contract extension this offseason, I guess, is just the best possible production you can get from that spot for the value.
Thanks for watching, everybody. Make sure you like and subscribe the video. And if you don't have a PFF Plus subscription, you can get one to see all the premium stats that we talked about here on the show, plus the expert betting and fantasy advice over at subscribe.pff.com. The description is also right below. So if you are not a PFF Plus subscriber, you can become one today.